Love and War by Oliver Hale. The year was 1943, and the world was engulfed in the flames of war. London, though battered by the relentless Blitz, stood resilient, its people clinging to hope amidst the chaos. The streets were a patchwork of rubble and resilience, where the hum of air raid sirens had become as familiar as the chime of Big Ben. Eleanor Hartley, a young woman of 23, worked as a nurse at St. Thomas Hospital. Her days were a blur of tending to the wounded, her nights spent in the dimly lit shelters, where the air was thick with fear and the faint scent of damp earth. She had seen too much, too many broken bodies, too many shattered lives, but she carried on, her spirit unyielding. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and crimson, Eleanor found herself walking along the Thames. The river, usually a mirror to the city's grandeur, now reflected the somber reality of war. She paused, her gaze fixed on the water, lost in thought. "It's not safe to be out alone," a voice interrupted her reverie. Startled, Eleanor turned to see a man in uniform standing a few feet away. His dark hair was out of place, his eyes a piercing shade of blue that seemed to see straight through her. He wore the insignia of the Royal Air Force, and though his posture was relaxed, there was an intensity about him that made her pulse quicken. "I could say the same to you," she replied, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. He smiled, a slow, easy smile that squinted the corners of his eyes. "Yes, but I'm not the one who looks like they've been carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "And you're not?" He chuckled, a rich, warm sound that seemed out of place in the grim surroundings. "Fair point. I'm James, by the way. James Whittaker." "Eleanor Hartley," she said, extending her hand. His grip was firm, his hand calloused from hours spent at the controls of a Spitfire. "Pleasure to meet you, Eleanor. Though I wish it were under better circumstances." They fell into step together, walking along the embankment as the city around them prepared for another night of uncertainty. The conversation flowed easily, as if they had known each other for years rather than minutes. James spoke of his missions, the thrill of flying, the camaraderie of his squadron. Eleanor shared stories of the hospital, the patients she had nursed back to health, the ones she had lost. As they reached the entrance to the underground shelter, James hesitated. "I'd like to see you again, Eleanor, if you're willing." She met his gaze, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. "I'd like that." Their meetings became a regular occurrence, a bright spot in the otherwise bleak landscape of war. James would often appear at the hospital, bringing with him small tokens, a bar of chocolate, a sprig of lavender, a book of poetry. Eleanor found herself looking forward to these moments. The way his presence seemed to lighten the burden she carried. One afternoon, as they sat in a small park, the air thick with the scent of blooming flowers, James turned to her. "Do you ever think about what life will be like after the war?" Eleanor sighed, her fingers tracing the edge of the blanket they sat on. "Sometimes. It's hard to imagine, though. So much has changed." "True," James agreed. "But some things remain the same. The sun still rises, the flowers still bloom, and people still fall in love." Her breath caught at his words, and she looked up to find him watching her intently. "James?" He reached for her hand, his touch gentle. "I know it's not the right time, Eleanor, but I can't help how I feel. You've become so important to me." Tears welled up in the corners of her eyes, and she blinked them away. "You're important to me too, James. More than you know." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of their unspoken feelings hanging in the air. Finally, James stood, pulling her to her feet. "Come on, let's get you back before the sirens start." The weeks turned into months, and their bond deepened. But war is a cruel mistress, and it wasn't long before James was called away on a mission. The night before he left, they met at their usual spot by the Thames. "I don't know how long I'll be gone," James said, his voice heavy with regret. "But I want you to know that I'll come back to you, no matter what." Eleanor fought back tears, her hands gripping his. "Promise me, James. Promise me you'll come back." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. "I promise." The days that followed were agonizing. Eleanor threw herself into her work, trying to distract herself from the gnawing worry that clung to her like a shadow. She wrote letters to James, pouring out her thoughts and feelings, though she had no way of knowing if they would ever reach him. One evening, as she sat in the shelter, the sound of distant explosions shaking the ground, a fellow nurse approached her. "Eleanor, there's someone here to see you." Her heart leapt, and she hurried to the entrance, hoping against hope that it was James. But it wasn't. Instead, she found a young pilot, his face pale and drawn. "Miss Hartley?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I'm sorry to tell you this, but James, he's missing in action." The world seemed to tilt. and Eleanor felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under her. "No," she whispered. "No, it can't be." The pilot handed her a letter, his hands shaking. "He wanted you to have this." With trembling fingers she opened the letter, her eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. "My dearest Eleanor, if you're reading this, then I'm sorry. Sorry that I couldn't keep my promise, sorry that I couldn't come back to you. But know this, no matter where I am, no matter what happens, I'll always be with you. You've given me something to fight for, something to believe in, and for that I'll be forever grateful. Yours always, James." Tears streamed down her face as she clutched the letter to her chest. "No," she whispered again, her voice breaking. "No, James." Months passed, and Eleanor tried to move on, though the pain of James's absence never fully faded. She threw herself into her work, finding solace in the lives she could save, even as she mourned the one she had lost. Then, one day, as she was tending to a patient, she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Eleanor?" She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly, she turned, her eyes widening as she saw James standing there, alive but changed. His face was thinner, his eyes shadowed, but he was there. "James," she whispered, her voice trembling. He took a step forward, his gaze never leaving hers. "I made a promise, remember?" Tears filled her eyes as she rushed to him, throwing her arms around his neck. He held her tightly, as if he never wanted to let go. "I thought I'd lost you," she sobbed, her face buried in his shoulder. "You'll never lose me," he murmured, his lips brushing against her hair. "Never." The war eventually came to an end, and though the scars remained, life began to return to some semblance of normalcy. James and Eleanor married in a small ceremony, surrounded by friends and family who had supported them through the darkest of times. As they stood together, hand in hand, looking out over the city they had fought so hard to protect, Eleanor felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. "We made it," she said softly, her voice filled with wonder. James squeezed her hand, his eyes shining with love. "We did, and no matter what the future holds, we'll face it together." And as the sun set over London, casting its golden light over the city, Eleanor knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, their love a beacon of hope in a world that had known too much darkness.